The Velhari ship Sovereign Patience had been stationed at the edge of the Sol system for 11 days before Commander Ethan Vel noticed the anomaly. It wasn't a military movement. It wasn't a signal. It was a cargo freighter, a human vessel, small and oxidized along its ventral hull in the way that always struck Velhari observers as vaguely unsettling, as though the humans couldn't be bothered to maintain the structural dignity of their own craft. The freighter was moving slowly, unhurried, along a trajectory that would take it directly through the quarantine boundary established by the Galactic Compact's Emergency Decree 7741 Omega. Ethan Vel watched it on his observation screen and said nothing for a long time. The quarantine boundary was not subtle. 412 vessels from 11 compact member species formed the blockade ring around Earth's system, a cordon so complete that not even light would pass through without being catalogued. The decree had been issued 43 days ago, after the Compact's Intelligence Directorate had concluded, with what they believed to be overwhelming evidence, that humanity had begun unauthorized development of a Class IV stellar manipulation device. The kind of device that, in the wrong hands, or more precisely, in the hands of a species barely 3 generations out of their first atmospheric flights, could destabilize a sun. The Compact had been very clear in their communication to Earth's unified government. Stop, submit to inspection, cooperate with decommissioning, or the boundary holds indefinitely. Earth's unified government had responded in 48 hours. The response had been 7 words long. We will discuss this when you're ready. 7 words, no ultimatum, no counter-demand, no military posturing, just 7 words that Ethan Vel had read 12 times and still couldn't fully parse. When you're ready. Not when they were ready, when you're ready. As though the Compact, 400 ships, 11 species, the governing body of 40% of the inhabited galaxy, was the one who needed to come to the table. And then the humans had gone quiet. That was 43 days ago. Now there was a freighter on his screen, moving toward the boundary at exactly the speed that would cross it in approximately 4 hours. And Ethan Vel had a very specific feeling in his secondary nerve cluster that he recognized as the biological equivalent of something is wrong here, and I cannot tell you what. He opened a channel to the freighter. Human vessel. This is Commander Ethan Vel of the Galactic Compact Enforcement Fleet. You are approaching a designated quarantine boundary under Emergency Decree 7741 Omega. Alter course immediately or be subject to... Commander, said the voice on the other end. Female. Calm. Not calm in the way a diplomat is calm, where the stillness is a performance layered over calculation. Calm in the way that a person is calm when they have already thought through every version of a situation and made peace with all of them. My name is Supervisor Yale Darren, Meridian Cargo Transit Authority. I'm carrying medical refrigerants and dialysis equipment to the Kepler Station outpost. My delivery window closes in 61 hours. I'd appreciate if you could process my transit waiver quickly. Ethan Vel stared at the screen. There are no transit waivers. The boundary is total. No exceptions. A brief pause. I see. Could you tell me who I'd speak to about filing an emergency humanitarian exception? I have patient files if that's helpful. There is no exception process. The boundary is total. Yes, you mentioned. Another pause, shorter. Okay, I'll hold here then. And she did. She simply stopped the freighter at the edge of the boundary and held position. Ethan Vel waited for a follow-up communication, a complaint, a threat, an appeal to a higher authority, something. Anything that fit the established behavioral matrix for a species being told no. Instead, there was nothing. The freighter sat at the boundary edge like a stone at the waterline, present, patient, going nowhere and making no noise about it. 4 hours passed, then 8. On the 12th hour, Ethan Vel checked his sensors again and found that 3 more human vessels had joined the freighter. All small, all holding position just outside the boundary. None of them hailing the fleet, none of them moving. He reported this to Fleet Admiral Morin, who commanded the blockade from the Compact Ascendant at the ring's center. Morin reviewed the data and dismissed it. Humans posture, he said. They'll make noise soon enough. Every species makes noise when they're frustrated. But the humans didn't make noise. By day 58 of the blockade, there were 23 vessels holding position at the boundary's edge. They were clustered in loose groups, not military formations, and they ranged from cargo haulers to what appeared to be a small passenger liner. Long-range analysis showed the passenger liner had been there for 9 days and was carrying a crew of 14. When Ethan Vell finally hailed them out of something he could only describe as professional curiosity mixed with a creeping unease, a young man answered. He said he was a student. He said he was supposed to be at an academic conference at Helix Station. He said, very simply and without apparent frustration, that he was waiting. Waiting for what? Ethan Vell asked. For the boundary to open, the young man said. It may not open for a very long time. I know, the young man said. I've got food for about 40 more days. After that, I'll turn back and try again when there's a resupply. He said this the way someone might say they plan to try a different route through traffic. Ethan Vell closed the channel and sat with that conversation for a long time. He pulled the behavioral prediction models the Compact Intelligence Directorate had filed when the boundary was established. The models were sophisticated. They'd been built on 3 decades of accumulated human observation data, cultural analysis, communication intercepts. The models predicted a human response to the blockade that followed a specific arc: initial compliance, growing agitation, political escalation within 40 days, attempted breach within 60, and full confrontational response within 90. The models gave 94.7% confidence to some form of aggressive action by day 60. It was day 58. There were 23 human vessels sitting quietly at his boundary like they'd brought sandwiches. He filed his observation report with the Intelligence Directorate. He used careful, precise language. He did not say he was concerned. He said the observed human behavior was statistically anomalous and warranted continued monitoring. He was, in the understated phrasing of his species, professionally disturbed. The Intelligence Directorate sent back an automated acknowledgement. They were monitoring. They were confident the situation was proceeding as predicted. Ethan Vell looked at the 23 ships on his screen and felt, for reasons he could not yet articulate, that the Intelligence Directorate had made a significant error somewhere. He just couldn't find it. Yale Darren had been drifting at the boundary for 16 days when her co-pilot, a 24-year-old named Seb who had joined her crew 6 months ago and still smiled too easily for someone in deep cargo transit, asked her whether she thought they were actually going to get through. She was running diagnostics on the refrigerant array when he asked. The dialysis equipment in Bay 3 was pulling more power than expected, and she'd been monitoring it closely, rerouting where she could, because the equipment wasn't hers and it wasn't for her, and if it degraded it would mean something specific and real for the people waiting for it on the other side of the boundary. Probably not this trip, she said. Then why are we still here? She finished the diagnostic before she answered. Because we're here, because if we leave, there's no record that we tried. And if there's no record we tried, then the Compact gets to say the boundary is clean and quiet and uncontested. Seb thought about that. So we're a protest. We're a presence, she said. There's a difference. What she didn't say, what she didn't need to say, because Seb had been in the service long enough to understand certain things without them being spoken, was that she had been watching the sensor feed for the last 16 days and counting. Not counting days, counting ships. The first week, 3 more vessels had arrived. The second week, 7. She'd started a log, cargo haulers, passenger transports, a research vessel, and 2 ships she couldn't immediately classify, all of them human. All of them holding position. None of them communicating with each other as far as she could tell. None of them coordinating. That was the part that sat with her at night when she was supposed to be sleeping in the 4-hour windows she allowed herself. No coordination. No one had organized this. No government directive, no fleet command, no unified protest movement. These were individual ships, individual people, all of whom had apparently arrived at the boundary, been told no, and decided separately without discussion, without even the social infrastructure of a shared channel, to simply stay. She didn't know what that meant yet. She wasn't sure anyone did, but she knew it meant something. On day 61 of the blockade, the Sovereign Patient's long-range sensors detected a new contact emerging from Earth's inner system. Not a freighter. Not a passenger transport. A research station mobile, a class typically used for deep space observation, moving on a slow transit trajectory that would bring it to the boundary in approximately 9 days. Ethan Vell cataloged it and filed a routine report. The next day, there were 2 more research stations on the same heading. The day after that, 4. They weren't warships. They weren't armed. They were laboratories and observatories, and the kind of long-duration habitat that humans built when they planned to be somewhere for a while. Ethan Vell tracked their trajectories with the growing certainty of someone watching a puzzle assemble itself in a language they don't yet speak. He filed a non-routine report this time. He requested a review conference with Fleet Admiral Morin. Morin reviewed the sensor data and remained unimpressed. Research vessels. They're probably conducting studies on the boundary itself. Humans are curious, it's a known trait. They're building up a presence at the boundary, Ethan Vell said. They can build all the presence they want. The boundary holds. Admiral, I've been tracking the cumulative mass of human vessels at the boundary edge for the last 9 days. Ethan Vell pulled the figures. The combined tonnage is now equivalent to a small space station. They have not fired a weapon. They have not issued a threat. They have not formally protested through compact diplomatic channels. They are simply accumulating. Morin studied the figures. What's your concern exactly, Commander? I'm not certain, Ethan Vell said, and this was true, and the fact that it was true bothered him more than anything else. In his 30 years of compact service, he had never filed a report whose conclusion was "I'm not certain." He was trained to be certain. The compact's entire intelligence apparatus was built on certainty, on behavioral models and predictive matrices and pattern recognition, advanced enough to anticipate the actions of civilizations before those civilizations had finished thinking about taking them. He was not certain. Keep monitoring, Morin said, and closed the conference. Ethan Vell kept monitoring. On day 70, a hospital ship arrived at the boundary. Not a military medical vessel, a civilian hospital ship, one of the kind humans deployed to disaster zones and refugee crises, white-hulled and enormous, with the human caduceus symbol visible across its broadside in letters 40 meters tall. It held position at the boundary with the same quiet patience as everything else. Long-range scans showed it was fully staffed and fully operational. 2 days later, a second hospital ship arrived. Ethan Vell stared at the data for a very long time. He understood in a sudden cold clarity what he was looking at. The hospital ships weren't a statement. They were preparation. The humans weren't gathering at the boundary to protest or to threaten or to negotiate. They were gathering at the boundary because they intended to stay, indefinitely, for as long as the boundary stood, and they were making sure that when people got sick in the waiting, there was somewhere to take them. He thought about the young student in the passenger liner who had 9 more days of food when they spoke, and had promised to resupply and come back. He opened his database of human behavioral literature, not the compact's analysis of human behavior, but actual human documents, history texts and personal accounts, and the kind of records a species generates when it's chronicling itself for itself rather than for outside observers. He'd had the database for 3 years and used it occasionally for contextual reference. He started reading it differently now. He found references to sieges in human history, not just military sieges, economic sieges, political sieges, social sieges. Humans had a long and detailed record of being told they could not pass, could not proceed, could not exist in a particular space or status or condition, and responding not with immediate force but with what he could only describe as sustained presence at the point of refusal. They had words for it. Sit-ins, vigils, blockade running not with warships but with civilians, a woman named Parks who had simply sat in a chair, a man named Gandhi who had walked to the sea. These were not metaphors for human military capability. They were something else entirely, and it was older than their military, and it had, in the historical record, a disturbing success rate. He filed a Priority 1 report to the Intelligence Directorate. He used the phrase fundamental model failure. He attached 400 pages of human historical documentation. He requested immediate review of the behavioral prediction matrices and a consultation with anyone in the Directorate's Xenocultural Division who had studied pre-spaceflight human conflict resolution. The Directorate reviewed his report in 3 days. Their response was 7 pages long and academically thorough, and concluded that Commander Ethan Vell's concerns, while noted, did not currently represent a strategic threat to boundary integrity, and that the human behavioral patterns he had identified were historically specific and unlikely to translate to a galactic-scale standoff situation. They were wrong, and the proof arrived 4 days later, not in any way he had anticipated. There was a woman named Dr. Siasia Toffa who had been on the research station Waypoint Helioder for 31 days when she asked to speak with someone from the compact fleet. Not a commander, not a diplomat, a scientist. She She explained in her hailing message, a xenobiologist, and she had a professional question. Ethan Vell, who was the closest thing to a scientist on sovereign patience by virtue of his analytical training, took the call. Dr. Toffa was a compact woman with dark skin and close-cropped gray hair, and the specific quality of stillness that Ethan Vell had come to associate in 43 days of watching humans at his boundary, with people who were not performing calm, but had simply arrived at it through some internal process he didn't fully understand. She was sitting in what appeared to be a laboratory. There were sample containers on the shelf behind her. She was holding a stylus. "Thank you for speaking with me," she said. "I promise this will be brief. I'm trying to complete a comparative metabolic study on extremophile organisms from the deep hydrothermal vents on Europa. I brought my sample set with me when I came to the boundary because I didn't want to lose research time. But I'm having difficulty calibrating my spectrographic array without a reference point from outside Sol system. I was wondering, and I understand if this isn't possible, whether any of your science staff might be willing to share calibration data from a standardized compact spectrographic array. Just the baseline numbers, it would help significantly." Ethan Vell stared at her. "You are asking me," he said slowly, "for scientific data. Calibration data, yes, I know it seems strange given the circumstances. I thought it was worth asking." He didn't know what he had expected her to say. A demand. An accusation, something about the students who had missed their conferences and the patients waiting for dialysis equipment. Instead, she was asking him for spectrographic calibration numbers so she could study deep-sea microbes from a moon she was not currently allowed to return to. "I'll need to check with my science officer," he said. "Of course, no rush." She glanced down at her stylus. "I'll be here." She would be there. Of course she would be there. She would be there for days or weeks or months, calibrating her spectrographic array and studying her extremophile organisms and presumably producing research that had nothing to do with stellar manipulation devices or compact emergency decrees, because that was what you did when you were a scientist and you were stuck somewhere and you had your samples with you. Ethan Vell's science officer provided the calibration data. He filed a report about the exchange that he almost didn't file because he couldn't explain why it felt significant. He filed it anyway. He was filing everything now. Day 89 of the blockade. The Intelligence Directorate's 94.7% prediction window for aggressive human action had closed 11 days ago. There had been no aggressive action. There were now, by Ethan Vell's count, 117 human vessels at the boundary edge, comprising a resident population. He had started thinking of it as a resident population of approximately 2,000 people. They had established what he could only describe as a community. Informal supply runs shuttled between vessels. The hospital ships had treated 43 patients. The research station Waypoint Helioder had published 2 papers, accessible through open academic channels on deep vent metabolic processes. Someone had apparently organized a children's school program on one of the larger cargo haulers. He had picked up the audio signals by accident. Someone was teaching mathematics. He stopped processing that information for 17 minutes. He wasn't sure why. He came back to his console and wrote in his personal log, which was not an official document and which he would not normally quote from, but which he now opened because the official reporting language was no longer adequate. "They are building a life at our boundary. Not a protest. Not a siege. A life. They are doing this because they intend to remain until this is over, and they appear constitutionally incapable of remaining somewhere without building something." He sat back and looked at the 117 ships on his screen. He thought about something he had read in the Human Historical Database, a specific passage from a document about a siege that had lasted 900 days. He remembered the number because it had struck him when he first read it as an error. 900 days. An unimaginable duration by the standards of any species the Compact had catalogued. Surely that was an exaggeration, a narrative inflation to add gravity to historical accounts. He had cross-referenced it. It wasn't an exaggeration. The people in that siege had survived by eating wallpaper paste and leather, by eating rats, by losing a third of their population to starvation and still refusing to yield because the alternative was something they found. In a calculus Ethan Vell was only now beginning to approach an understanding of worse than the cost of continuing. He opened a channel to Fleet Admiral Morin. "Admiral," he said, I need to revise my previous assessment significantly. Yale Darren's dialysis equipment had been running on partial power for 30 days, kept functional by a series of increasingly creative engineering workarounds that Seb had become almost frighteningly good at. The refrigerants were still viable. She checked them every 6 hours. She did not let herself think about what it would mean if they weren't, because there was no productive action associated with that thought, and she had learned a long time ago. In a childhood she didn't often discuss, in a city that had been without water for 8 months when she was 11 years old, that there were thoughts you didn't let yourself have because having them didn't get the water running any faster. She had been at the boundary for 81 days. She had spoken to the compact commander, Vel. She'd learned his name 11 times, always briefly, always practical. Once he had asked her with a formality that felt like it was covering something more genuine how the dialysis equipment was holding up. She had told him honestly. He had been quiet for a moment and then said he hoped it held. She had thanked him and meant it. She didn't know what he was thinking. She suspected he was thinking quite a lot. On day 94, Fleet Admiral Morin requested a diplomatic channel to Earth's unified government. The request was, by compact protocol, a significant concession. The compact didn't request diplomatic channels with species under quarantine restrictions. The compact sent directives and waited for compliance. Requesting a channel was an acknowledgement that there was something to discuss, which was an acknowledgement that the current situation was not simply a species failing to comply with a directive, which was an acknowledgement of Ethan Vel read the diplomatic request and understood that someone above Morin had looked at the sensor data and done the arithmetic. 117 ships, 2,000 people, a school, 2 hospital ships, research papers. 11 days past the 94.7% probability window, and the ships were still arriving. Earth's unified government accepted the diplomatic request in 4 hours. Their opening message was 6 words: "We're ready when you are." The compact's internal deliberations over the next 6 days were not shared with Ethan Vel in full, but he received enough traffic to understand their shape. The Intelligence Directorate had begun a comprehensive review of their behavioral prediction models. There were internal debates about the nature of the stellar manipulation device claim. It emerged, slowly, that the original intelligence on which Emergency Decree 7741 Omega had been based was a misidentification of a human long-range solar observation array, an instrument for watching their star rather than manipulating it. Not a weapon, a telescope. A very large telescope pointed at the sun because humans found their own star scientifically interesting, and the compact's instruments had read its power signature as something else. 43 days of boundary, 117 ships, 2,000 people in improvised community, 900 days in Leningrad eating wallpaper paste, a misidentified telescope. Ethan Vel wrote in his personal log again, "They knew. They must have known we had made an error." The 7-word response, the refusal to justify, the silence, "They knew we would find it ourselves if we looked long enough, and they simply waited." They were willing to wait indefinitely, building their lives at our boundary until we arrived at the truth under our own power. They did not argue. They did not explain. They made themselves an undeniable presence and let us prove ourselves wrong. He stopped. He read it back. He tried to find the flaw in his analysis and couldn't. They had done something the compact had no behavioral model for. They hadn't defied the boundary with force. They hadn't negotiated around it. They had stood at it, 2,000 people, a school, 2 hospitals, a xenobiologist studying deep-sea microbes, and waited with a patience so absolute, so daily and domestic and quietly undeniable, that continuing to hold the boundary had begun to feel, to the compact members watching, not like strength but like absurdity. It had not been a military strategy. It had not been a diplomatic strategy. It had been something older than both, something encoded in a species that had survived ice ages and plagues and civilizations collapsing under their own weight by doing the one thing that apparently no other spacefaring species had mastered to the same cellular, instinctive, reflexive degree. Enduring, not heroically, not dramatically, just enduringly. A woman checking refrigerant levels every 6 hours. A young man learning creative engineering. A xenobiologist calibrating her spectrographic array. A student who promised to resupply and come back. Ethan Vell looked at 117 ships on his screen and thought about the difference between a civilization that survived things and a civilization that was built from its deepest foundations to treat survival as a baseline expectation rather than an achievement. The boundary came down on day 98. It did not come down with ceremony. There was no dramatic declaration, no fleet formation signaling the end of the standoff, no grand gesture from either side. Fleet Admiral Morin transmitted a formal suspension of emergency Decree 7741, Omega, pending diplomatic review, using the standard compact phrasing that meant we are doing this carefully and without admitting specific error. And the 412 ships in the cordon ring adjusted their positions, and the path was open. Yale Darren had been asleep for 2 hours when Seb woke her. She came to the bridge still pulling her jacket on, and he wordlessly pointed at the nav display, and she looked at the open corridor through the ring and didn't say anything for a long time. "You should file the transit request," Seb said. "Yeah," she said. She was still looking at the display. "The equipment," he said. "It's been 98 days. We should move." "I know." She sat down. Her hands were steady when she pulled up the transit request interface. They were always steady when she had something to do. The shaking, she had found, always came after in the quiet when there was nothing left that needed doing and the body finally had time to remember what it had been carrying. She filed the transit request. The compact system processed it in 40 seconds, faster than she had ever seen a transit request processed, and returned a clean green authorization. She set course. Around her, through the viewport, she could see the other ships at the boundary beginning to move. Not all at once, not in any organized fashion. One at a time, finding their headings, going where they had been going 98 days ago when someone told them they couldn't. The passenger liner was already through. She could see the hospital ships preparing transit. The research stations were moving slowly, as research stations always did, unhurried, carrying their samples and their calibrations and their published papers. She thought about calling Commander Vell. She thought about what she would say. She had things she could say about the dialysis equipment and the patients who had waited 98 extra days for it, about what it had meant to watch that community form at the boundary edge, about the strange, compressed life of those 3 months that felt already like something she would never quite have the right words for. She decided not to call. There was nothing he needed from her, and she thought he probably had enough to think about. She was right. Ethan Vell watched the boundary dissolve. He tracked every human vessel as it passed through the gap in the ring, cataloged them one by one, partly from professional habit and partly from something he couldn't name, some sense that each ship was a specific thing that deserved specific acknowledgement. The cargo hauler with the dialysis equipment. The passenger liner with the academic conference attendees who were now 98 days late. The xenobiologist's research station. The school vessel. The hospital ships, still white, enormous, marked with the caduceus. He watched them pass, and he thought about the Intelligence Directorate's report, now in full revision, and the conversations happening at the highest levels of the compact about what exactly had happened here and what it meant, and what, going forward, could be predicted about humanity. He thought they were going to have a very difficult time. He thought about the behavioral prediction models and their 94.7% certainty, and their fundamental failure to account for something so basic it was embarrassing. That a species with that history, that specific history, that catalog of ice ages and plagues, and 900-day sieges and women sitting in chairs and men walking to the sea, didn't have the same relationship to prolonged resistance that every other species in the compact did. Other species had thresholds. Other species had breaking points that could be measured and modeled and predicted. When the cost of continuation exceeded the perceived probability of success, rational civilization stopped. Humans had the same threshold. They just put it somewhere else, somewhere further, somewhere so far out that in 98 days of a blockade backed by 400 ships, not one of them had reached it. And they had done it without weapons, without raised voices, without a single transmitted threat. They had done it by showing up and staying, day after day, building schools and treating the sick and studying deep-sea microbes, living their ordinary lives in extraordinary defiance of the idea that the boundary was real and permanent and final. They had done it by refusing, in the most mundane and domestic and undramatic way imaginable, to accept that the word no spoken by authority was the same thing as no spoken by reality. He sat at his console for a long time after the last human ship had passed through. He opened his personal log. He stared at the blank entry field. He was not sure what he wanted to record. He was not sure his language, had the right shape for it. He thought about what the compact would say about this, officially. The review would find the intelligence error. There would be formal apologies. There would be diplomatic language about the importance of verification protocols. There would be academic papers, compact papers this time, about human behavioral anomalies and the inadequacy of existing predictive models. None of it would capture what he had actually watched for 98 days. He finally wrote, "The question we must ask is not whether humans are dangerous. They are not the strongest species we have encountered, nor the fastest, nor the most technologically advanced. They are not, by any conventional measure, the most formidable. The question is different. The question is what you call a species that has no internal mechanism for accepting permanent defeat. That has no evolutionary subroutine that says, the cost is too high, stop now, it is over. That responds to being told no by building a school at the point of refusal and waiting with perfect, ordinary, devastating patience. I don't know what you call that. I know what it does." He closed the log. On his sensor screen, the last human ship, Yale Darren's cargo hauler, the Meridian Helioder, oxidized along its ventral hull in the way he had always found vaguely unsettling, passed through the gap in the compact ring, and continued on its heading toward Kepler Station. He watched it until it was beyond his sensor range. Then he looked at the space where 117 ships had been, now empty, and thought about how it hadn't looked like a battlefield. It hadn't looked like a victory. It hadn't looked like anything the compact had a word for. It had looked like a neighborhood that had quietly, patiently, without announcement, ceased to need permission to exist. And somewhere in the deep architecture of the Galactic Compact's intelligence apparatus, in the behavioral models and the predictive matrices and the cultural analysis databases built across 30 years of human observation, something had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently, the way a foundation shifts when it encounters not a greater force, but a different kind of ground entirely. The kind that doesn't move. The kind that has never moved. The kind that learned long ago in ice and plague and darkness, and the long, impossible wait for morning, that the most dangerous thing a civilization can do is not to fight. It is to remain.